But anyway, my name is Jack Pezda. I'm the director of the center, and I want to introduce tonight's panel. Now, the procedure for tonight is this, that each panelist will speak for 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so. And then following that, I'll introduce some questions, but we really want to have questions from the audience. And as you know, this issue is very, very important. You know, the interfaith approach to the LGBTQ community and efforts to try to make others understand our society, understand people in our society who are diverse in a lot of different ways. And so we think it's important. In any case, to my immediate left, Yahya Alazrak represents Transfaith organization. He is a second-generation radical queer, the child of a very active trans-Muslim faith leader. He, while he was a student at Guilford College, and has experienced a lot of different religious orientations. His spiritual journey began as a Sunni Muslim, and in addition to that, he became involved with Unitarian Universalism. He now is a Muslim and practices Sufism, which I don't know if you know that. It's a branch of Islam that is very mystical and very tolerant, and one that doesn't always have universal acceptance in the Islamic community. He's also involved with radical Christianity and Quakerism, and he currently works at Resource Generation as a national organization and coordinator for people of color. In addition to second over is Reverend Jennifer Bradley. Reverend Bradley is associate pastor of the First Baptist Church in Moorestown, New Jersey. Her ministry focus is being guided by the spirit of love and peace and to companion others on their journey so that together we may do justice. She has a master's degree, Master of Divinity degree from Eastern Baptist Theological Ceremony, and in addition to her position at the First Baptist Church of Moorestown, Reverend Bradley is a full-time business manager at the Bradley Funeral Home. She also shares her life with Sandy Lehrer, who for almost 25 years have been together, and she, in 2013, when the first same-sex marriage act made it legal, of course, married. And then from my far left, Rabbi Jennifer Frenkel. Rabbi Jennifer Frenkel is the senior rabbi of Congregation M'Kor Shalom in Cherry Hill. She grew up in Oak Park, Michigan. It's a suburb of Detroit. Graduated from Michigan State University with a Bachelor of Arts degree in anthropology and a specialization in Jewish studies. She received her Master of Arts degree in Hebrew letters from Hebrew Union College. And she currently serves as the past president of the Tri-County Board of Rabbis, as a member of the Institutional Review Board for the Kennedy Health System. She's also involved with the Jewish Hospice Advisory Council, and of course, overall, very much tied to her community. So at this point, I'd like each of the panelists, and we'll begin with Yahya, to make a brief statement, and then I'll ask a couple of questions. And really, I would love to hear your questions and your comments and the experiences, okay? Yahya.
Thanks so much, Jack. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I think I want to tell a little bit about what my life story has been, I think kind of towards this articulation of the importance of having welcoming and affirming religious communities. I was born in Casablanca, Morocco, to an Arab North African Moroccan dad and a white American mom. And when I was a year and a half old, they got divorced and I moved to the United States. Yeah, as it said in my bio, when I was about 8 years old, my mom came out as trans, and so I still call him my mom, even though he uses he, him pronouns now. And that pretty much excluded us from the Muslim community here in the US. At the time, sexuality and gender, even binary gender conversations weren't really happening in the Muslim community. And so we felt like we had a lot of fear about engaging with the Muslim community here in the US. And so what that meant for me was that I was getting a lot of my education about what Islam was and what it meant to be a Muslim from my father, who still lived in Morocco, who is a very orthodox, very strict, he's kind of a jerk, and learned a pretty narrow interpretation of the faith, which I think was kind of in line with, I think, kind of a cross-religion move towards the right and towards conservatism that started happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, kind of around the world. And so yeah, as a young person in high school, I really started grappling with this kind of narrow, fear-based faith that I was being taught by my father. And in college, I ended up kind of leaving Islam, at least in faith and practice, although I think with the climate of Islamophobia in this country, I think very adamantly still identified culturally as a Muslim. And I think that experience for me broke my mom's heart as somebody who has been a practicing Muslim since they were 15 years old, and really wanted to be able to pass Islam on to me and on to my brother, but didn't have a community of support, and they couldn't really be very religious in their queer community, or the queer community didn't know how to support them in trying to raise a religious family, and of course they couldn't be accepted as a queer and trans person in the Muslim community. We did end up finding some hospice in the Unitarian Universalist Church, which is where I spent my high school years, but still wasn't being supported very much in our Muslim faith. My mom, Tynan, has been a trans Muslim leader for about the past 20 years, kind of organizing at the periphery of Islam and with many different organizations over the years. There's Al-Fatiha, which was an LGBTQ Muslim organization in the 90s, and more recently with Masjid, which is the Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity. In that time, I think maybe about 7 years ago, there started being a national queer Muslim retreat that started happening, bringing together Muslims from all over the queer spectrum to just be present and be in community with each other. And so probably for like the first 5 years that this was going on, like every year my mom would be like, hey, there's this really cool retreat that's happening. You should really come. It's a really wonderful community. And I was like, yeah, the Muslim thing, like not really my speed anymore. And 2 years ago, I went to the retreat for the first time, and my life was absolutely changed. I cried every single day in a really good, healing, transformative kind of way, and realized that, at least in small pockets, that the face of Islam was beginning to change, and that there were people like me and different than me that felt like there was room in Islam for us. And I think perhaps more importantly, I felt empowered to not only claim Islam as my own, but to be a part of defining what it is, that no one person can define what a faith is, or what is permissible or not permissible within a faith tradition, but that over hundreds of years and millennia, it's the people and the practice that, at the end of the day, determine what is and is not a part of that faith. So these days, I identify as a radical Christian, as a Quaker, and I'm slowly re-entering the world of Islam through the lens of Sufism. And to connect this also to Transfaith, so about 3 years ago, I was fresh out of undergrad And my mom was like, hey, there's this really cool organization. They're looking for a treasurer. You did numbers in college. You did some clubs. You should be on their board. And I was like, sure. Like, I did a lot of clubs in college, and boards just seemed like the grown-up version of clubs. And so I joined the board of Transfaith. At the time, I identified as kind of like a cisgendered ally to the trans community. But yeah, over the course of my involvement with Transfaith, there's kind of been like a parallel journey of my deepening my own understanding of my gender identity. I identify as non-binary and genderqueer now, as well as being able to be a part of like a really beautiful, like multiracial and intergenerational trans community through my work with Transfaith. And Transfaith is a national nonprofit. We kind of serve as like a switchboard and connector and a community for trans-identified spiritual and cultural workers within a lot of different denominations and different communities. And yeah, I think that the past few years, I think, have been incredibly inspiring because I think I've been able to witness, I think, kind of this great return to faith and to institutionalized religion. Transfaith just co-sponsored the spirituality track at the Philadelphia Trans Health Conference, which is the largest conference for trans-identified people in the world. And like 5 or 6 years ago, there were maybe 2 or 3 workshops that touched on spirituality, maybe 20 or 30 people that were interested in such topics. And this year we had over 100 discrete programs just within the spirituality track, and hundreds, if not thousands of people participating in that programming. And so yeah, I think it's been, I think wonderful to see that I think so many communities and faith communities are moving towards being welcoming and affirming, and really just seeing people as people in our congregations and in our communities. And I think it's a little bittersweet for people like my mom, who really wish that had been around 10, 20 years ago. But I think there's some redemption in the fact that it's happening now. And I think the Muslim community at large, I think, has a little bit farther to go. I think some people like to say that the Muslim community is like 20 or 30 years behind kind of like the progressive Protestant flank in terms of progressivism around social issues. But yeah, the conversations are starting. And yeah, I think I'm feeling really optimistic and excited about the direction things are going in. So.
Yes, and I think a point that it was very important that you made. Of course, there are Muslims and there are Muslims, and as you know, like any religion, there are different branches of the religion. And as you know, the three most famous are the Sunni and the Shia, and of course Sufis. But within those, there are also there are other divisions and other nuances that exist in people's belief systems. But one of the things I think that, as far as Islam is concerned, we tend to think of Islam and the Middle East. Only about 25% of all Muslims in the world live in the Middle East. That it's a religion, it's a world religion of over 1 billion believers, and very often belief systems are shaped by the culture in which they develop and also the cultures into which they spread. So there are a lot of different practices that are not necessarily part of any canonical religious faith that exist in one Muslim community in one country that may not exist in others. So it is a very diverse religion, and it is the fastest growing large religion in the world. But anyway, we will come back with some questions, and I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions as well for Yahya. Now, Reverend Jennifer Bradley, who introduced earlier, is, as I mentioned, associate pastor of the First Baptist Church in Moorestown, and she is a South Jersey native who attended and graduated from Cherokee High School. So,
Go Chiefs.
Go Chiefs. Well, anyway, Reverend Bradley.
Thank you, Jeff. creating safe spaces. Creating a safe space in a community of faith is very important to me, and I'd like to just give you a little bit more of my background so that you understand why it's so important to me. I grew up in the church. Church was always important in our home. You went to church, you wore a dress, and you enjoyed it. But I did, as I grew up, as I got older, I did enjoy church. It wasn't something that was so forced on me and that I was battling. But what I was battling was that I always knew I was gay, and I always knew that I was going to do something in the church. I didn't know exactly what it was or connected with the church, and that still even now is fleshing itself out. But so I always knew I was gay. I always knew I was going to be doing something in a church or in religious circles, and I always knew that because I was a Christian that I couldn't be gay. And I struggled with that. And so church was not necessarily a safe space for me growing up. I won't out that church that's in Marlton, but it wasn't the safest place for me. It's becoming safer, thankfully. But so in struggling with my faith and coming out, in trying very hard to be straight and not succeeding, thankfully, I finally came to a place where I was able to embrace my sexuality and my faith. And that was because I found a church. I got involved in a church in college where my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, her advisor said, "You two should really come to my church." And this was we went. I should say that we went to a Christian college, so it's always sort of nice when the catcher falls in love with the shortstop. It just all collides. But I am so thankful for Dr. Morgan that she told us about Central Baptist Church in Wayne. She said, "Come here. You can be who you are. You can work through this stuff here. You have people you can talk to. It's a safe place." So maybe a mile from campus, we were able to find a safe place, to be around safe people, to ask questions, to struggle with answers, but to be who we are, who we were at the time, and also to find that our faith and our sexuality, they could live together. So safe spaces are so important to me. Because I'm so thankful that I had a safe space when I was 19, 20 years old. I don't know what my life would look like, to be truthfully honest right now, if I didn't have that community of faith there to stand with me, to challenge me, to help me grow and heal. So moving on from there, I then went to seminary, and during seminary, I did my internship at a Baptist church in Cherry Hill. That I was there for about 2 years during my internship, and they called me as the associate pastor, which was fantastic because they were fantastic people. The senior pastor was great, and we worked wonderfully together. But I was not out, and my theory was, I'm not going to come out until I have to come out, or until someone asks me, and I will not lie. And I guess I was the associate for maybe 3 months. I had been the intern for 2 years, and through some wonderful grapevine, the senior pastor said to me, "Hey, I need to talk to you after church." And I said, "Okay." Yeah. So we went through the whole service together, served communion, read scripture together. Everything, all those important things that I love about church, we did that together. And after service, he said, "I need to ask you a question." I said, "Sure." And he said, "Are you a homosexual?" And this was 98, so people were still using the word homosexual. And I said, and I couldn't believe it. I'm like, oh my gosh, this was not supposed to happen yet. I was supposed to be in a church. I was supposed to be settled. I was supposed to have everything together. My parents still aren't on board really with me being gay. And I said, I am. he said, we can't work together. And so that night, I led youth group while the executive board met and decided they were going to ask for my resignation, which I gave them 2 days later. I'm now 46. Would I have done things differently? Yeah. But I'm also very grateful for where I am now in life. So let me say something. So the Baptists, we're a different bunch in the sense that you can have a Baptist on this corner of the street, and you can have a Baptist on that corner of the street, and they can be night and day. I think one of the wonderful things about the Baptist Church, and I'm part of the American Baptist Church, one thing that's great about the American Baptist Church is that we work hard to exist under an umbrella. And on this side of the umbrella, there are churches that won't ordain women. On this side of the umbrella, there are churches that will ordain the out lesbian. But we can exist together. We can find common ground. We, like many mainline denominations, are struggling with that. That's something that we at First Baptist Moorestown are struggling with. We left ABC of New Jersey because the American Baptist Churches of New Jersey were so conservative, and they were going to fight my ordination. And so we joined a region where we could, and we've always sort of been pushed aside in our region. We've never really had a place at the table. So now we're a part of a region, the Rochester-Genesee region, which is a lot more like-minded folks, and also folks that believe in that umbrella, that you can have people on either end come together and do justice and work for love and peace that's at our core. So I found my way to the First Baptist Church of Moorestown in about 98, 99, and someone said, hey, you might want to check that church out. They're a little more progressive. And I thought, really? In Moorestown? Those people? And they were right. And it was a wonderful, welcoming community, and I came there pretty hurt and damaged. I mean, my wife probably didn't walk through the doors there for a year or so, because she was like, no, I don't care how nice you say they are. And but so I continued going, and I went before the diaconate, who was the board, the folks that would regarding membership, and told them a little bit about myself. And at the end, I said, and if you're going to, if you have a problem with this, if you could please tell me now, because I've already been hurt, and I don't want to form relationships with you all, only to have them, break down again. I said, I don't know if I can handle that. And an older gentleman who was a retired minister came up to me, and he gave me a big hug, put his arms around me. He said, you have any problems, you come to me. He said, we do not believe in asking people to leave our church. We believe that everyone is welcome. Everyone has a call to ministry, and I believe you will find a home here. And I did. And so I attended and I continue to go to First Baptist Moorestown. About 5 years ago, our new pastor challenged me and really said, where are you in your call? Where are you feeling the movement in your life as far as ministry and God calling you to the beat of your heart, essentially? And I said, I don't know. And so she provided me a safe space to be able to really work through my call and revisiting ordination. And technically, I'm not a reverend yet. That'll happen in March, because I gave up on the ordination process back in '98, and have just revisited that now, and excuse me, and have decided to go forward with that, with the local ordination from our church, recognized by the Alliance of Baptists, which is a progressive arm of the Baptist Church, American Baptists, Southern Baptists, and Cooperative Baptists. So, so right now it's sort of just Pastor Bradley. We don't want anyone to. I'm still enjoying just the pastor line there. And So safe spaces are very important. In fact, I even shared with someone, I said, oh, I'm going to Camden County College. There's this creating safe spaces and looking at, interfaith dialogue and, in our communities of faith, how do we have those safe spaces for the LGBTQIA community? And I said, and honestly, I am a little nervous. I said, I know it's safe spaces, but am I really safe? And I think because of my experience, I'm always sort of just have a little question in the back of my mind, like, is it really safe? Is there someone that's going to be, yell something offensive? Because I've been in those situations, and it just makes you sort of look over your shoulder, look around the crowd and go, oh yeah, it looks pretty good. I think I'm okay here. Just smile and So creating safe spaces in communities of faith, in educational institutions, because I know darn well I was not in a safe space in undergrad, as my girlfriend and I, we had dorm hours at Eastern. It was a Christian college, so the boys had to be out of the dorm at a certain hour. The girls could be in the dorm all the time, but we wanted to honor the rules of campus, and but you didn't want anyone else to have an inkling that you were gay, because it would be reported to the residence hall director and things like that. So I appreciate now that I know Eastern is moving toward a more open acceptance of LGBTQIA people, and I mean there's a lot further to go, I think, but so that's why it's important to me, and that's why I work hard wherever I am, be it at the church, in my community, at my full-time job, to create safe spaces, to do my best to project that I'm a safe person and this is a safe place for you to be who you are. So, thank you.
Okay. Before I introduce Rabbi Frenkel, I have to make a confession. Here we are at an interfaith gathering, and confession, I'm told, is good for the soul. And especially I'm concerned our friend Alan Hernandez is recovering from a bout with virus. And so I want to ask you one thing, though, that when I make this confession, please don't share it with Ellen. Because when I was hastily looking over the bios of the speakers, I noticed, for example, that Rabbi Frenkel is from the state of Michigan. Now, Michigan, like all states in America, has different religious groups, they have different political groups, and then there's another division between two state universities, the University of Michigan and Michigan State. And I insensitively suggested to Rabbi Frenkel that, and I asked if she graduated from the University of Michigan. I saw the startled look on her face, the look of disappointment, and I realized the egregious error that I had made. And I was afraid that maybe she wouldn't take part in the panel as a result. But anyway, she graduated from Michigan State University, and in Michigan, those two schools and devotion to those schools take on a religious connotation. So with that, Rabbi, I'm so glad that you decided to stay with us.
Absolutely, that's quite an introduction. So as I mentioned to Jack earlier, when you give a rabbi a microphone and only give him about 10 minutes to speak, it's very difficult. So I'll try to keep my remarks short. I appreciate the invitation from Jack and Ellen to come tonight as an ally and a supporter of the LGBTQ community, and also as the senior rabbi of Congregation M'Kor Shalom in Cherry Hill. The words M'Kor Shalom in Hebrew are translated into English as source of peace. And we are a congregation that is part of the Reform Jewish movement. We are the largest denomination within Judaism. There's over 900 Reform congregations within America, over 2.2 million Reform Jews within the United States. So we are the most liberal of the Jewish movements. We have Orthodoxy on the right traditionally, conservative right about in the middle, that's really in transition with a lot of their social and political ideas, their theological notions. Sometimes they lean a little more towards the Orthodox right, sometimes a little more to the Reform left, and we tend to be theologically, practically, ritually on the left-hand side. So what that means is that we are completely inclusive, diverse community, and as both of my colleagues spoke about, that we really strive to create that sense of sacred space for all members of our congregational community, from our youngest members in our preschool all the way through our senior members. And it was a reminder hearing both of you share your personal stories of what kind of power we have as clergy and religious leaders to make sure that we are creating those safe spaces, particularly for those members, and from our own experience for some of our teenagers who are just starting to wrestle with these ideas of their gender identity, of their sexuality identity, and what that can mean for them. So when I'm asked to take a look at these values of Judaism that we hold sacred, I really narrowed it down to two, especially because I was given 10 minutes. So the first one that we always talk about is this idea, it comes right from the very beginning of the book of Genesis in the Bible, that we are all created b'tselem Elohim, which means we're all created in the image of God. In the book of Genesis, when God created humanity, God blew into our nostrils nishmat chayim, the breath of life. God didn't distinguish between what person looked like what person, what they identified as, but within every person, that spark of our soul is the spark of God. And so we hold that as one of our ideals, one of our core values at Congregation M'Kor Shalom, that no matter who walks through our doors, they are treated not only as a person, but really as a living emanation of God. The second value that we hold sacred is this idea that we are created to participate in the role of tikkun olam, the healing and repairing of the world. The idea is that when we come into life, we show our gratitude and our thankfulness for the gift of life by making sure that we leave the world a little better off than we found it. And one of the ways we do so within the Reform movement is that we're very active in social action and social justice initiatives. So we were the first denomination to stand with the LGBTQ communities since the 1960s. We were also the first denomination and the first organization of clergy people that supported marriage equality and marriage rights, and came out back in 2000 to allow our clergy to choose to officiate at same-sex weddings, marriages. However, that particular clergy person defined what that ceremony would be with the couple. So we are completely comfortable officiating at all types of marriage ceremonies, and really remembering that there is holiness within what that couple brings to the table together in their relationship. So I've been honored to teach students who are searching and trying to figure out who they are and what they stand for, no matter if their families are accepting of that or not, that we are really able to be a place where they can find that safe space and a safe person to talk to. And I also, I don't want to go through my 10 minutes without mentioning, before we get into the questions, the very often misquoted, misinterpreted biblical passage that really creates so many problems within Judaism, I imagine within some of the other religious denominations as well. And that's, of course, this verse in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 13, that says, if a man lies with a male as one lies with a woman, the two of them have done an abhorrent thing. They shall be put to death. Their blood guilt is upon them. This one particular verse has come to really create problems between several denominations within Judaism. The Orthodox, of course, interpreting it very literally. I'll talk about a couple of the problems with that in a moment. The conservative tradition trying to understand what to do with this in a modern context. And the Reformed tradition that says, of course, we cannot take this literally, just like we don't necessarily hold somebody as ritually unclean if they touch a gecko in the afternoon, just like we don't require the brother of a man who is deceased but left his wife without a male child, we don't require that the brother marry the woman to then have a son. So just like we don't stone our rebellious sons, we also need to find ways to interpret our biblical tradition in ways that are meaningful and relevant to our society in this modern age. And Reform Judaism, I believe, has really moved leaps and bounds in this direction of making sure that a religious tradition can remain relevant and speak to where we are today. And so if we don't look at that verse literally, then what do we do with it? How do we, from the Reformed Jewish perspective, I work with LGBTQ colleagues, those of us that have students in our religious school, what do we do with that verse when we teach it? And so there's three alternate ways to look at that verse from Leviticus. And the first one is that in Judaism, someone is only responsible for a religious obligation if they are free to choose to perform that ritual or that obligation. And because so many of us firmly believe that sexual identity, gender identity is not just a choice, we can't hold somebody accountable for living a genuine life. Why wouldn't we respect that and affirm that as sacred? The second issue, again, is this idea that if we're going to take it literally, there's a lot of other traditions, other rituals, other verses in the Bible that we would also have to take literally that none of us is willing to do. And the third reason is that that verse from Leviticus is talking in its own social and cultural context. And back then, when this passage was written, if a man lay with another man as he would a woman, we are not talking about a monogamous, loving, compassionate relationship like we are seeing with same-sex partnership today. These were acts of domination and trying to embarrass a passive partner in a way that we would never see as sacred in 2017. So I will leave it with that.
Okay, now, actually, our panelists have answered all the questions that Alan gave me, so that presents a bit of a problem. So I'm going to try to make up some of my own questions on spur of the moment. But one of the things, Rabbi, is that apparently there is some discussion between the various branches of Judaism on these matters and other matters.
Absolutely.
That discussion continues, and have there been, have you noticed any progress in recent years?
Yeah, a lot of the progress has been made intra-denominationally, not necessarily talking across the denominations. But that happens too. It's one of the reasons why I served as president of the Tri-County Board of Rabbis, to bring rabbis of all denominations together. Because one of the questions that I do hope we get to is kind of what our congregations and organizations are doing today to help create these safe spaces that my colleagues have talked about. And one of the things that we're doing and trying to do across the denominations is to make sure that we're cognizant and conscious of the language we're using. And I think we can all learn a lot from one another and from our own experiences when we do discuss those things.
And I'm so pleased to hear that, and I think that is an important question. It was one of Ellen's questions. Now, is it only Reform Judaism that has women as rabbis?
No, our conservative colleagues are also being ordained as female.
Okay, is
rabbis.
this relatively new, or is it something that's...
The Reform movement has been ordaining female rabbis since the mid-1970s. I believe the conservative tradition about a decade later or so. The Reform movement also ordains gay and lesbian rabbis, and they just ordained a transgender rabbi, I would say, I think maybe about 5-10 years ago.
And, Pastor, what is it that your church is doing to try to improve understanding with the LGBT community?
Well, I think we intentionally, about 10 years ago, started an education process and dialogue in our community of faith to look at becoming a part of the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists, and affectionately called AWAB. AWAB is the American Baptist organization that in the Methodist Church they have reconciling ministries. In the UCC Church they have open and affirming, and we have the welcoming and affirming Baptists. So we, as a church, we wanted to join we started a discussion to join AWAB. And this was an interesting time in the church, because at the time there were, I think there were maybe 4 or 5 of us in the church who were out. And so almost every discussion that happened, can you make it Wednesday night? Because we're going to discuss the book, All Are Welcome. Yes, okay, and so it was a tough time. Looking back, it really it took a lot out of that small group of us, but we knew how important it was. So this was something we started years ago, looking at Scripture, hearing people's stories, looking at our church tradition, and then in 2007, 2008, we joined the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists, and and then we went through a couple years, and someone said, well, what are we doing? Are we doing anything? You know, we have this tag now, but the conversation sort of stopped. And part of my perception was, right, but look at those of us in our community. We're reading Scripture, we're leading worship, and we are out, and we can sit in the pew with our spouse or our boyfriend or our girlfriend and not be concerned that someone's going to say, oh, isn't Jennifer sitting a little close to that other woman? But that we could be in church as we are. And so there was that conversation that happened, and then where we've gone now, right now, as far as continuing to be a safe space and an inclusive community, is that we have a group that meets monthly. It's called the Community, the letter Q, Munity, and our intention is to provide a community for the LGBTQ community at First Baptist. And our intention is to provide spiritual and social support for one another. And we're not, we could, but we're not, having an intense Bible study. We're just sitting around, sharing a meal, sharing conversation, finding out what's going on in each other's lives, and truly becoming a community that can be there for one another. So it's, in fact, someone at church the other day said, I can't make it to the community meeting. I said, oh, it's okay. And he said, I have to go to a birthday brunch for my sister in South Philly. He's like, I'd much rather be with my chosen family. And that's really what we've become to each other, is a chosen family. And just doing other fun events, but and then also finding out what are some of the needs in our area. One of the folks in the community is involved with a group in Camden and Atlantic City, and they needed coats and winter clothing. So we've had the coat, we had the winter clothing drive, and then we have another gentleman involved in the community, and he's actually coming home from Puerto Rico, bringing his grandfather home, and we're finding out some of the needs that his community, and also another woman in the church, she has relatives in Puerto Rico, what they need right now. So we're doing a battery and a lantern collection right now, and we actually have physical addresses where we can send things to that we know they'll receive it. So really trying to give back, and we all know that people have been there for us when we've needed them, and that's something that we as a community believe that we need to do. Is there are others that are in need, and we need to give back. So, but you look at our congregation, and we're involved throughout in every part of the church. We're on boards. We're we're the president of boards. We're setting up the hospitality, and just from top to bottom, which is, so that's, did that answer what you? One other thing that I think I missed though is we are working on our bylaws. And when you said language, 10, 12 years ago, we revisited our bylaws and said, do these reflect who we are as a community? No, let's change some wording and different things. We're at that time now, again, where the gender identity, that's nowhere to be seen in our bylaws. But when we talk about who we are as a community, we say all are welcome, regardless of your sexual orientation or your gender identity. But that's not reflected in the paper. So that is one of the ways that we are working on our paper policy to match our actual living policy.
Very good.
And it goes for little logistical things too. I mean, we even looked at our membership forms because it was brought to our attention that when a parent registers their child for religious school, the form just up until a few years ago said mother's name and father's name rather than parent one or parent two, recognizing that all families look different. And that paper policy is really something that we needed to continue to look at and how we use that language.
And I think it's also very important that the various faiths come together, not just on this issue, but on all issues. Now, there is an interfaith group in Cherry Hill, Moorestown area that meets regularly to share a meal and to talk about their respective faiths. And that group has, I think, done a lot of good work over the last, 10, 15 years or so. But when we talk about interfaith, actually, Yahya, you seem to give new meaning to the words ecumenism in the sense that you've been to the various stages with various religions, and I think you probably bring a perspective that those who have only been identified with one religion, or as Universal Church sometimes says that they believe in one God at most, but nonetheless, maybe you could share your experience and what organizations that you've been involved with and what they've done in order to try to bridge the gaps between people over LGBTQ issues.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I think that, as I mentioned earlier, when I was in high school, we were members of the Unitarian Universalist Society. In my town, we didn't even like the word church. But for those of you who aren't familiar, UUs are a very humanist tradition that are very affirming of everyone being on their own spiritual path. So a service might, open with some Jewish scripture, and it might close with something from a Buddhist tradition, but basically the entire congregation is bringing their traditions together. And I mean, I think UUs, especially in the Northeast, have also been fairly progressive. I think coming out of a more intellectual, academic, and humanist tradition. So that congregation always felt like home, and for a while I even wondered if I had a call to more traditional ministry because of my strong involvement in that community. But it was lacking a little bit of God for me. There was one God at most, so I think that Quakerism and the Society of Friends, especially the more progressive branches of it, because they're other denominations, there's a lot of shades of Quakers. Even their evangelical friends who look look very much like other Protestant evangelical churches. And then there's the more progressive Philly area liberal Quakers. And those kind of Quakers, I think, really, really spoke to me, and that I felt like I could be able to be my full person. And we were talking about God a little bit. But I think in terms of work that's been done to, I think be welcoming and affirming of LGBTQ folks. I think I really want to return, I think, to the organizing that, that my mom, Ty, has been a part of. He was he didn't found, but quickly became on the leadership of the organization Al-Fatiha in the late 90s, which at that time there was no open public conversation about queer Muslims even existing. It got started by a dear friend of the family, Faisal Alam, who recruited for this organization by posting on message boards, which were very early. They were a new thing in those days. And basically posted like, oh my God, can you believe that there are these out public gay Muslims that are trying to have their own organization, condemn them to hell, oh my goodness. And within a day, he was getting hundreds of emails from people who were interested in becoming a part of this organization. And so secretly, and kind of outside of the public sphere, there was a real hunger and thirst, I think, for the conversation of how do we reconcile queer identity with Islam. And so yeah, my mom started working with Faisal in the late 90s towards figuring out what a queer Muslim community could look like here in the United States. And I think for most of that, he was also one of the few trans people in the room, and so more recently, there's been a partnership with Transfaith, the organization that I sit on the board of, called the Trans and Muslim Project. So for the first time ever, at the most recent Philadelphia Trans Health Conference, we were able to get some grant funding to bring together about 10 trans-identified Muslims to just be in the same space together and to talk about what are the unique needs of trans Muslims and what kind of change do we want to see, both in our congregations, but even within the progressive Muslim community. There's a growing progressive Muslim movement that's been growing over the past 15 years that's very LGB affirming, but it's the leadership, I think, has always been allies, no offense to allies, but there hasn't been a real integration of queer and trans leadership. And so I think oftentimes what they've been providing hasn't been meeting the needs of the community in the way that it does when you have queer and trans people at all levels of an organization. So I think I'm really excited about the Trans and Muslim Project. I think it's a very, 10 years ago, it would have been perhaps dangerous to even have a public conversation about this sort of thing. But we're, in a different time now. And so I think I'm really excited about the potential of, getting, I think, the growing visibility that there are trans-identified Muslims here in the United States. And that we're fighting for a seat at the table in terms of defining what Islam is and can be.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, one thing a little note about the Unitarian Church, which you're very much involved, that just one personal experience, a couple of personal experiences. I was twice asked to be the guest minister at the church in Cherry Hill. And my wife was concerned that I would be, eventually charged with blasphemy or some other crimes against religion. But the point was that their church service was organized on learning about other religions. And so my role there was to talk about some ancient religions that I was familiar with. But it is a very opening thing. They used to run an organization called Lib that was for to bring couples of various persuasions together. And I don't know if they still do that or not. But I think that through the various faith groups, that this is a way to bring people together on social issues and a whole range of other issues. And one of the questions that Ellen asked is, what advice would you have, Pastor Bradley, for other organizations to create, both within their organization and to reach out to other organizations, a more sensitive attitude towards LGBTQ and other social issues?
I think one of the most important things is to be able to hear others' experiences and stories. I think that it's not until you hear about the journey that someone has walked, once you hear that, you then develop a better understanding for the need for safe spaces, the need for LGBTQIA people to be welcomed and affirmed in communities of faith. So I think for communities and people who are trying to have more of a inclusive community, to go out and hear those stories. Be that safe person that someone can hear the story. Call a community of faith and say, hey, in fact, this is happening in Moorestown right now. There's another church in Moorestown that's looking to becoming part of the reconciling churches. And they sent an email and said, hey, I got your name off the website and read about you, and can we meet? I'd like to talk with you because we're looking at becoming part of the reconciling churches of the United Methodist Church. And we're just starting this discussion, and we'd like to hear the process your church went through. So I think it's important for the allies to reach out, and likewise, we have a job to do. We as queer people to tell our stories. And it was interesting, my wife and I were talking, and she was saying, this is something you have to do because you already lost your job 20 years ago. Your parents really weren't sticking by you too much then. They are now. But you can tell your story, and you have nothing to lose. When I sort of said earlier about how, is this a safe space? That was she said, it's going to be, you can tell your story. There are people that can't tell your story. So this is a responsibility you have to tell your story, because I have a job that I'm not going to lose. I'm part of a faith community that loves me and supports me, and I love them and support them. But I know that there are people right now who aren't in that position, that if they stood in front of a group of 15 people and said, I'm a lesbian, they could lose their job. Their families could turn their backs on them. Their faith community could say, you are not welcome here. So I think there's a responsibility for the allies and also for us, that we have to put ourselves out there and say, here's my story, and let me share it with you. Here's the great parts of it, here's the not so great parts of it, but please take those back so that your community can then be an inclusive and safe space.
And as you know, legally in the United States, there has been regression in terms of protecting the rights of LGBTQ individuals, that states have passed laws that eliminate any anti-discrimination legal protections to LGBTQ communities. And that's disturbing, because it's definitely going into the past. Suggestions that you have, Rabbi Frenkel?
I couldn't agree more. Really, to be able to talk, to be able to engage in conversation, to be willing to listen, and to be willing to change. And congregations, and I can only speak for the Jewish congregations, are not always willing to change easily. And we need to admit when we get it wrong. We need to learn from our mistakes, and we need to do better the next time for our families and for our members.
Yes, thank you. And Yahya, any suggestions to other groups as to what can be done?
Yeah, so some of our work at Transfaith is around like providing education and consulting to congregations that are hoping to become more welcoming and affirming of trans identified people. And so our version of Trans 101 is really, I think, about what both of you are saying, that it's really about getting to know people as people. Somebody can stand at the front of the room all day defining, terms and going over biology and, doing this kind of really academic exercise, but at the end of the day, becoming a welcoming and community is about being able to have that vulnerability, to hear each other's stories, and to be able to share your joys and your struggles. I think a lot of our work is really kind of just demystifying the idea, right, that trans people are people, and that you can be in community with them in just the same way that you can be in community with any other person, and all of the same tools apply, from small groups and storytelling and breaking bread together and all of that.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, we'd like to hear your questions and your comments. Yes.
So, your mother, when he came out, obviously had difficulty as he found a mosque. Is the community, is that happening in Islam right now?
Yeah.
At least in our area?
I moved to Philly 2.5 years ago, so I'm like new to this area. I will say that I think kind of post the Orlando massacre that happened last year, there is at least a posturing towards kind of more progressive orientations, or there's conversations starting in a lot of Muslim communities, and a lot of mosques that I think are still very much in the early stages. But I think that my mom's leadership and organizing has led to is that he founded his own Muslim community in Western Massachusetts. It's called Jamiat al-Inshira, and it meets in the basement of the Unitarian Church, where he is also a member. But I think that, there's a group in Chicago that's also started that is a feminist, queer, and trans-led mosque. There's a couple progressive mosques around the country, most notably in DC, New York, and LA, that have mixed gender prayer and allow openly queer and trans individuals to be a member of the congregation. And I think here in Philly, they were kind of there's a lot of us in terms of being queer and trans Muslims. Philadelphia has such a long Muslim history, but I think we're kind of a ragtag bunch that meets up for potlucks and brunch sometimes, but haven't yet organized. I think a religious space, and I think that what I would add to that is that I think many of us are also still reconciling what our relationship is to faith. At the LGBT Muslim retreat that happens every year, you have some folks that are waking up at 5:30 in the morning to pray dawn prayers together, and then you have some folks that are staying out until 1 a.m. getting drunk in the city of Philadelphia at the clubs. And so and those aren't mutually exclusive categories, but I think that we're all in, I think, a different journey of what reconciling means, and I don't think there hasn't yet been that burning desire to create a more formal religious institution yet in Philly.
Yes.
It's kind of a rambling question. I have a daughter who is non-binary and who is genderqueer and has been brought up just down the road at Temple Manual and has always been very, very involved in our synagogue. And I know she struggles with being or feeling other because, as she puts it, it's like when people would ask my black friends, what's the black perspective on this? And that she feels in terms of outing herself, that there might be a special program, but she said it's like when they do something for the special needs kids. I don't want to be the special needs Jew. I'm just a Jew. And yet how do I find that place that is not making me example A? Suggestions on that, because I know there must be times as people who are involved as clergy that you must have to take a stand either with parents or your board or people to say, how do you make this a more organic experience, or how do you counsel someone like my daughter who comes to you and says, how do you make this work? How do you help me make this work? So I'm just throwing that out to all of you.
Okay. Rabbi Frenkel, maybe you want to start with this?
Sure. I can only speak from the perspective of our teens, some who are very comfortable with where they are in this journey, and some who are still very much questioning. It was interesting when I was preparing my remarks for tonight, and one of the questions was, what has your congregation done? Some of these programs and events, and I really had to think about it. we tend not to do those programs and events for that exact reason, that it attracts a certain group of people who then feel outed and getting their perspective on things rather than feeling like an inclusive community. So for us, it really hasn't been an issue. Perhaps it's a disservice because we're not hosting those programs and events on site. We certainly publicize them when they happen in the community. But we feel that it happens organically. It's through conversation, and it's through people feeling included in every aspect of congregational life. And perhaps it's because at our congregation, the teenagers moving through that process now are not the first within our congregation. We have clergy role models who have also made that journey themselves. So I think with that collaboration, it's made it a little easier for our board to understand and for our congregation to understand that we don't look to our teenagers or even to certain members of our congregation for the LGBTQ opinion on things. You know, we work through those issues and situations as a collective community.
Yes, questions?
In general, whether it's a house of faith or a public school, which is my background now, we're all trying to create that safe space. And everybody's been very articulate about how they've created it in our own community. How do we translate that to that other synagogue, the other church, the other high school? You know, our school might be safe. How do we get the school down the street to be safe? How do you do it with another Baptist church or another synagogue?
Pastor Bradley.
I think one of the things is we have most towns have a local ministerium, and for good or ill, I'm sort of exempt from the ministerium meetings, but having attended a few, it is about the communities of faith coming together. Hey, what's going on around town? You know, oh, we just found these flyers that were racist on front lawns. You know, did you hear about this? And that conversation starts. How can we, as the clergy in town, come together to address that's happening? We're the most progressive, other than the Quakers in town, in Moorestown, which there's a wonderful Quaker community in Moorestown. We're Quaker town. So, but we're pretty progressive and not always heard very well. But I am thankful that our senior pastor, Reverend Pepe, continues to stand up for what she believes in, stand up as one of the few women around the table, one is as an ally who stands proud and tall next to us, and she brings that to ministerium. It's not always heard well, but that's our town. It's a conservative town, and we know what we're dealing with. So I think it is important to ministerium is important so that we can be the progressive synagogue, the progressive Baptist, if you can believe that, the progressive Muslim at the table, so that when the parent of a child comes to the clergy person and says, "Hey, my daughter's gay," that clergy can say, "I don't know what I'm doing, but you know what, let me talk to that Baptist minister because I think she knows what's going on there." So I think ministeriums, and like schools, when I guess this, and how the schools come together in different, when the principals have their state principal meetings, that's where some of those ideas and thoughts can be shared.
Yes.
I have a question for Yahya. You used the term radical Christian. I've never heard that. What is a radical Christian? I have to tell you, my diverse background is I was raised a Southern Baptist, taught in the Quaker boarding school for a number of years, and had found my way when I was in my 20s to become a very observant Jew. So I've kind of crossed the spectrum, but I've never heard the term radical Christian.
Yeah. I think it's probably because I feel like I need a qualifier there, because I think that, I think unfortunately, right, I think that the right wing, has really kind of co-opted Christianity in a lot of ways, and I think we're kind of drawing it out to mean a certain set of values, and so I think it's trying to push back on that. I think more specifically, I also identify as a red letter Christian, which is even more geekery. But in some older versions of the Bible, the red letters were the words of Jesus Christ, and so I think being a lot more interested in the life and example of Jesus Christ than perhaps some of the speculation and drawing out of the narrative that was done by some of the different disciples. And I think for me, right, like I feel like I think a lot of Christians, right, that the ultimate call of Jesus was of love and of really striving to embody a love ethic and a life of love, and that I think that really wrestling with what that means, I think for me, I think really leads me to I think positions that are considered radical in our current political climate, to be anti-racist, to be critical of capitalism, and to I think be radically welcoming and affirming of others. And I think there's also a long tradition, I think, of Christians that have embodied that, whether it's like liberation theology movements here in the United States or in South America, looking at the Catholic workers movement here in the United States. But I think trying to draw on the lineage of Christians that were countercultural, and in my personal opinion, I think closer to the truth of the teachings of Jesus Christ. So that's.
It's interesting that there are forces, of course, that try to divide us rather than unite us, and unfortunately, sometimes these forces hold high positions in various organizations. But for example, one of the criticisms of Muslims is that they don't denounce terrorists. Hundreds of Muslim religious leaders have denounced terrorism, and also about 70 leading Muslim organizations worldwide have denounced terrorism, not just for being anti-Muslim, but they actually use terms like this: they are demonic. But this is just one example, and so somehow whatever a small group of terrorists do is somehow blamed on a whole religion, a whole billion people, and that's
I think
unfortunate.
that happens with radicalization in anything, because when you have radical right-wing Jews who stone women at the wall and who attack people because they're not dressed the way they think they should be dressed in terms of modesty, I think our problem becomes in any religious denomination or sect, you get radicalism that refuses to see anything else except their narrow worldview.
But it's important to know that there are voices, majority voices, who speak out against this, and that's true of all of our religious faiths. Now, obviously, we all share different religious views. Sometimes some are believers, some are non-believers, and I think it's important that we bring together people of different faiths to talk about this issue. But I hope to also bring them together again to talk about other issues, both in our own society and worldwide as well. Let me ask you this: any further questions or comments? Any comments people have? Yes.
So you talked about the importance of diction in affirming people, and you mentioned how you changed your forms to say parent 1 and 2. Do you have gender on your forms also? And if you do, is it binary or is it open-ended?
We took it off, I would say, maybe about 3 years ago. Same way that we have now non-gendered bathrooms, gender-neutral bathrooms. We have, in terms of how we separate some of our youth groups for activities. It was very common to do, boys on one side, girls on the other, and now we don't. And that came about because we had students in our religious school who didn't identify as one or the other. And so that was a learning experience for us through that conversation with that family. And it was an instance where we didn't get it right the first time, but we were willing to have that sacred conversation. And I think that goes over to a point that you had made earlier about how do we get other people on board with some of the things we're doing. To me, it's all part of that sacred conversation. And that if we can find those sacred partners in the community, our voice gets louder and stronger.
Yes, questions? Well, one thing, I do hope that you join us for the Hate Post Charlottesville event that we're having on November the 16th, because it's very much tied to what we were talking about tonight. And we would like to see as large a turnout as possible. As I said, bring a friend or bring a couple of friends. But on behalf of the Center at Camden County College, we thank you very much for participating in this. And we
Thank
hope
you.
to establish ties in the future and to perhaps establish some partnerships. So thank you very much for coming out.